Hello, everybody, and welcome to My Favourite Mystic. I'm your guest host today, Robert Dickins. You may have heard me from such wonderful podcasts as My Favourite Mystic, Episode 1. It's going to be a very special episode today for the weird and wonderful world of mysticism, as we have the guest speaker, the incredible AJ Langley. So I'd like to say hi to Amanda and tell us a little bit about yourself and what it's like to be on the other side of the podcast for the first time.
Well, that second question is really easy to answer, and it's that I hate it. Thank you so much to every guest I have ever had on this podcast for being so willing to do this. You're all amazing. And thank you, Rob, for agreeing to do this. It was, in fact, your idea. When we recorded the very first episode of the podcast, you insisted that when I made it to a year, I would let you interview me about my favorite mystic. And here we are. This is the 1-year anniversary episode of the podcast. As far as telling you a little bit about me, my name's AJ Langley, and I host this podcast normally. I am a PhD student at Queen Mary University of London, working with the incredible Miri Rubin. And I'm working on a dissertation about the woman I'm here to speak about today, who is commonly known as Agnes Blannbekin.
Well, thank you very much, Amanda. We're very excited to hear about Agnes. As is traditional with this wonderful podcast, though, I think we need to get into the grips of you and your relationship with the weird and wonderful world of mysticism. So how on earth or in heavens did you find yourself studying this brilliant topic?
I love asking other people this question because I always feel like their answers are much more interesting than mine. Although I think everybody kind of falls into mysticism somehow. In my case, I was already interested in the weird and wonderful world of otherworldliness. I started out my undergraduate degree as a classics major, primarily because I was really interested in mythology. And then I took one medieval history course and was immediately attracted to the medieval period. And from there, I found my first mystic, who was Marjorie Kemp, in a course on late medieval religious culture. And she ended up being the topic of my major paper for that year, as well as my topic for my master's dissertation. I have always wanted to be a professor, to work in higher education. And so I knew I was going to do a master's and a PhD eventually. And Marjorie Kemp was 100% my gateway mystic. I found some really interesting things in her work that I couldn't explain immediately. And that is always fun for someone, I think, who really enjoys research, is when you get something that you can't explain, but you know that there needs to be an explanation, it means that you have digging to do. And I think that that's always a really good feeling. So yeah, I found mysticism generally through Marjorie. And then I found Agnes through Marjorie as well, almost. I was compiling a list of secondary literature and other primary sources for my master's dissertation, kind of trying to get a feel for what mysticism was like more generally in this period. And I found Agnes's name on a list and then looked a little bit at her visions and thought to myself, she's going to be the one after this. She is going to get a lot more of my attention from now on. And yeah, I've been with her ever since.
Is there a big leap going from Kemp to the Venerable Agnes? I mean, are they contemporaries with each other? What's the medieval context there?
So they're not contemporaries. Agnes is 13th century, Marjorie is late 14th, early 15th century. Marjorie is in England, Agnes is in Austria. Agnes's work is very heavily influenced by the fact that she had a Franciscan confessor, so there's a lot in there about the Franciscan order. They seem to be concerned about different areas of piety. Listeners to the podcast will have already heard about Marjorie's many pilgrimages and her associations with other holy women and ecclesiastic officials, whereas we don't have that much in Agnes's work that refers to those kinds of things. Her visions tend to be much more about confession and liturgy and appropriate behavior for Christians and religious persons. So the works are very different in a lot of different ways. So it was a bit of a leap, but a very fun one to make.
Ah, super interesting. So when you're doing history moving from Britain in the 15th century to Austria in the 13th century, I mean, are we dealing with something recognizably that is mysticism? or are they different enough and unique enough to perhaps be taken apart a little more?
This is one of those questions that I think comes down to how do you define mysticism, and avid listeners to the podcast will know that I am not willing to do that. For me, they both reach out to and have interactions with the divine in similar enough ways that it wasn't a huge leap. They're both definitely recognizable as some sort of experiential mysticism. So, yeah, they weren't too dissimilar in that way. I think the kinds of things that they talk about, the subjects they're interested in, the way that they see the world is slightly different. But I think there's been an unfortunate tendency to group the works of female mystics of the late medieval period together as a kind of unified concept, that we are now just getting better at recognizing that even though they are very similar in a lot of ways, that doesn't mean they're homogenous. And that's kind of the fun of them, is that they're all different individuals who led different lives in different periods, in different social and cultural and historical contexts. And we can find those things in their works when we look through them. It adds so many layers to these works, and that's one of the reasons I enjoy them so much.
So in my own work, I find if you're looking at mystics and if you're looking at, I don't know, anyone who's doing any kind of altered state consciousness stuff, whether that be like mysticism or yogic practices or certain substance taking, there seems to be this wonderful playoff between the life of the person involved, kind of social background of what they're doing, and the things that their texts produce. And it quite often feels that the conversation between those elements is quite strong, but then the mystical, the symbolism that's appearing in the text also has this kind of universal element involved with it. So, I mean, I wonder with Agnes, how much of her life is underpinning the text and how much of it is going on with like wider theological conversations.
The thing is with her, it's really hard to say because we just don't know that much about her. There's a lot of things that people have kind of made assumptions about who she is and the life that she was leading and what her life meant. But the one thing that I think does really underpin a lot of the things she's talking about, she's highly influenced by Franciscans. So there's a lot of theological connections and elements of discussion of religious practice that are either speaking directly to Franciscans or are reminiscent of the values that the Franciscan order generally held. She's not that concerned with bridal mysticism. There's a little bit of it. The bride is used as a metaphor a few times, but in that vision, she's not the spouse in the way we see with some mystics acting as the spouse of God. So we don't have that element, which I think people expect to see in female mysticism. And then as far as her status and active life, we just don't know. She seems to have been able to support herself. There's no discussion of her having any sort of job or any patron or any community that she was relying on for funding her life of prayer. So we don't have the charitable works or the teaching that we see in the lives of some mystics from this period. Theologically, like I say, she's very aligned with the Franciscans. She's very focused on communion, on the humanity of Christ, and the importance of prayer. There's some elements of wider theological understanding of, for example, the importance of having a pope. She's very concerned about the brief papal schism that happens during her lifetime, where we have a few years where there isn't a pope, and she seems very concerned about that. There's also elements of interest in bodily reunification and whether or not the bits that get cut off of people and holy figures in their lives end up reuniting with them in the afterlife, or whether they remain on earth. There's also a kind of a ranking of the saints that happens at one point where she kind of ranks them based on their deeds.
Who's her favorite?
Who's her favorite? Oh, good. Well, not her favorite. God's favorite is obviously the Virgin Mary, which I say God's favorite because she is ranked the highest amongst all holy figures, but she doesn't actually appear in Agnes's work that much. She doesn't seem to feature as a touchstone for Agnes so much as Agnes acknowledges that as the mother of Christ, as his connection to humanity, she therefore must rank really highly. So she's pretty theologically sound in her ranking in a lot of ways. There's a couple of odd insertions. She talks about how St. Bartholomew is ranked really highly because he suffered so much. And that seems to be more of an echoing of her interest in suffering as a way of achieving holiness and as a way of proving one's love to God, rather than because Bartholomew is a particularly prominent saint in her area or in her period. But she doesn't seem to have a particular favorite. It's more about how you earn the seat that you get, with the saints being used as examples rather than her trotting out her own favorites.
I mean, I love the idea that she's basically running a sort of medieval top 10 television program where she's going, coming in at number 10, we have St. Francis, known for X, X, and X. I think that's brilliant. There's a question that Amanda and I have talked about in private over the years that I think is really important to address here. And you've been talking about Agnes Blannbekin as this living, breathing person. And I wonder, having looked at her work so much, like, what evidence do we have for her? Do you think she was a real person, or are we really talking about a kind of textual invention of a character?
You mentioned that this is something that we've talked about in private, and I have to say, this was the first conversation that Rob and I ever actually had. We did our PhDs together, and the day we met, I told him what I was doing my PhD on, and he immediately asked me,
was she real or is she just made up? And I was affronted. I was so angry that anyone would dare to doubt whether or not she was a real person. Of course she was. What a ridiculous question. And it turns out that I don't know.
As I mentioned earlier, she doesn't really have a name. We don't know anything about her family. We get very little information about her life. As far as hagiography as a genre, they're works that are meant to venerate a person. They're part of a cult of saints. They get used in canonization procedures, but we don't have her name. We don't know who she was. Considering how very public some of her visions and ecstatic revelations seem to be, a lot of the time they're discussed as happening in church during Mass. We have no record of this woman outside of this work. So one of the things that I'm doing in my PhD research is trying to identify how much identity this protagonist actually has versus those visions in which she is merely acting as a witness, attempting to convey a particular message to her audience rather than it being about her. So yeah, I'm still unsure whether or not she was a real person. But also this work led me to the revelation that it doesn't really matter if she was a real person. She's constructed as a real person. So even if she is completely fictional, she represents what a Franciscan in Vienna in the 13th century thought a female mystic who was devoutly religious would be like. The kind of things she would care about, the kind of visions she would have, and the way that she would attempt to convey those messages. And that in itself is really interesting to me. So I still don't know the answer to whether or not she was a real person. I will never be able to know for sure, but I have spent several enjoyable years slowly picking this apart and increasing my doubt over and over again. And it all started, Rob, with you, and I blame you for it entirely.
What about the manufacture of the text itself? Does it purport to tell you, did she have an amanuensis, or she was just like in a hospital having dreams and then relaying them to someone? Like, how did it purport to have come about?
Again, we don't have a lot of details about that. The first thing recorded in the work is a preface from her scribe, basically saying that he's recording these works for the edification of humanity in the hopes of increasing the love and devotion and dedication towards God through sharing these revelations. Next thing that we have is the first recorded vision in the text. Now, this isn't the first vision that this mystic ever had. It's merely the first one that is recorded. And the reason for that is it kind of starts with the seeing of everything. So she says that she sees a divine light inside of a man, and in this light there is all things, all of the elements of the world. And then she kind of moves forward and that talks about heaven and about the Virgin Mary and about the Trinity and progression of humanity and the saints. And then that vision ends with a conversation between the mystic and her scribe. He asks her, did you bring anything back from this vision with you? And she says yes, and lists a couple of things that she brought back with her, some gifts that she was given from God. And one of them is that she is able to recall these visions now. It mentions that she'd had visionary experiences previously, but when she went to try to remember them, she experienced a lapse in memory, which the scribe then reinforces, saying that he witnessed this from her as well. But after this point, after this vision that starts out the work, she is then able to not only recall all of the visions that she had previously, but almost re-enter those states. It says that when she wants to contemplate a certain vision, she's able to access it again. So that kind of sets up why the recording is able to happen when it is that it's after this vision happens. She also has an experience that's quite similar to female mystics of the period, where she has a revelation that she doesn't necessarily want to share with her confessor, and then becomes ill and disconsolate and is very unhappy and very afraid until she agrees to tell her confessor about it. And from them, and it seems, all of her visions are recorded. The recording process is always basically a summary of the vision. The scribe will write, "She was in church on this day, and the hand of God came upon her, and she went into ecstasy, and she saw," and then write out what she saw. In some cases, we also see that this is actually edited by him in the moment. Like, he'll say, "She saw many things, I will list 3, or something like that. These interjections are rare, but I always find them very interesting when they happen. So the work does seem to be a collection of visions more than a vita or a life necessarily, and that is something that, again, I'm really exploring in my dissertation. But as far as the construction of this work, it does seem to just be a list of all of the visions that she had and all of the symbolism in them, and the message that is inside of those visions for the witness, for the audience of them.
That's amazing. So it's like an executive summary.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, he summarizes the kind of things she talks about. And it means that it gets straight to the point with regards to the symbolism. There isn't a lot of convoluted messaging that the audience needs to work through for themselves. She is very point blank in describing the things that she sees and what they mean. In fact, I'm gonna read a passage here. It's one of my favorites, and I think it kind of exemplifies a lot of the things that are going on in this work. So it starts by saying, "Taken into the spirit before the feast day of Palm Sunday, she saw 5 types of confessors who heard people's confession. Some had the heads of pigs and soiled snouts. Others had the heads of dogs. Others had thoroughly frightening devilish dispositions and faces like larvae. Others had human faces, but spattered with blood. Others had radiant human faces, which were illumined by a certain divine light. Therefore, very surprised when she saw this, and wondering what it meant, she heard the voice within herself, as above, which said, 'Those who have a pig's head and snout are confessors who hear confessions because of temporal profit and advantage. Those with a dog's head are confessors who hear confessions because of praise and vainglory and favors. In themselves unclean, they clean the wounds of others by licking and healing with their tongue. Those who have satanic shapes are apostates and other sacrilegious persons whom God does not want you to know in order to spare you. Those who have human faces spattered with blood are confessors who violently force people to confess even that which they do not need to, and inquire about carnal matters for their own pleasure, and they are polluted within themselves. Those who have radiant human faces are confessors who hear confessions purely for God's sake and the salvation of souls.'" So there's a lot of different elements of the work that kind of come through in this one vision. So confession is a major concern of this mystics, and she talks about it regularly in a lot of different ways. You can see kind of the listing here as well of these different kinds of confessors that she lists out, giving them a physical appearance and then immediately giving you the symbolism of what that means in this particular context. So you don't have to think about it and work it out for yourself. It's all right there. And it also doesn't elaborate beyond that. She's been brought into this vision purely to witness that these confessors exist, that these are who they really are. But there's no additional message. There's no go back and tell anybody. There's no, and so we need to bring these confessors to justice. There's nothing actionable about this vision. It's purely to let people know that there are confessors out there who are hearing confessions for the wrong reasons, and what those wrong reasons might be, as well as there are one group of confessors, only one out of all those listed, that actively, purely hear confessions for God's sake and for the salvation of souls. And that is the only reason that anyone should be hearing confession. On top of all of that, there's then the added aspect of this vision happening on Palm Sunday. So that's the Sunday prior to Easter. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 stated that all Christians should confess their sins at least once a year and receive the sacrament on Easter. So the idea that a week before, people would be concerned about making sure that they were confessing and thinking about who it is that is hearing their confessions and therefore giving them their penance to then pay that penance prior to taking the sacrament the following weekend is an additional really interesting point that would have had specific significance to that liturgical timing. So I really enjoy that passage. I think it tells you a lot about the kind of work you're getting into when you're reading this and the way things are structured. There's obviously a lot more visions that talk about how to be a good Christian and the way that Christians should prepare themselves for confession, but I really like that as kind of an overarching example of the kinds of things that get talked about in the work and how they're structured.
I mean, speaking of good Christian women, I know this wonderful podcast often has more salacious elements involved in the discussion of the mystics, and I wonder if that's as true for Agnes as it is for others.
I mean, yeah, it is. There is a particular vision that is the most well-known of her work. If people know about her, they know about this vision and potentially nothing else, because it is the one that gets brought up in works about female mysticism of the period. And yeah, so there is one particular vision that is salacious to a modern audience, but wouldn't necessarily have been seen that way by her contemporaries.
Come on then, what is it? What's the rub, so to speak?
I mean, so to speak is right. So she has a vision. It's at the end of a series of visions that are on the feast day of the circumcision, which is a very big feast day during the medieval period. And she's thinking about all of the gifts that Christ gave to humanity from the time of his birth through to the time of his death. The main one, obviously, with her interest in the Eucharist, being that he gave his body to humanity, not only through his sacrifice and his passion, but also as a regular remembrance of him through the Eucharist, through the sacrament. So she's thinking about all of these things on the day celebrating the first time that a part of his body was removed, namely the Feast of the Circumcision, and finds herself wondering what happened to his foreskin, whether it remained on earth or whether on the day of his resurrection, whether it was resurrected with him and his body was made whole once more.
It's quite a practical question as well, isn't it? I mean, if people are dying on battlefields and things like that.
Exactly. Bodily reunification after death and what the glorified body looks like in heaven are big topics of theological debate and conversation during this period. But the reason that this vision gets so much attention is not just because she's thinking about Christ's foreskin, but because in the manner of the Eucharist, while she is wondering about it, she feels in her mouth what she describes as a small skin like that of an egg that she swallows, and then it reappears in her mouth, and then she tries to touch it with her finger, but it disappears down the back of her throat. And that happens upwards of 100 times. So that portion of it, the idea of her swallowing Christ's foreskin, is what gets talked about as though it's an incredibly scandalous thing. Moreover, this doesn't just happen the once. It's only really discussed as happening the once. It happens a second time. But in that case, it is Agnes asking Christ for it to happen again as a way of confirming to her that she is meant to share this vision with her confessor. And the reason she's concerned about sharing it is not necessarily because she thinks that it was scandalous or sexual in any way, but rather because this vision confirms to her that Christ's foreskin is in heaven, not on earth. And that is something that is contested during this period. So this vision is actually part of her discretio spiritum. So it's how she has it confirmed to her that she's speaking to Christ and not to a demonic presence, in that if Christ's foreskin was in heaven with him, then the ability for it to manifest in any sense as part of a miracle, as part of the sacrament and the Eucharist and the body of Christ, that could only happen through a divine intervention. So it plays a really big part in her spirituality in that moment. But her concerns about sharing it with her confessor are actually much more related to whether or not this is a heretical thing to say, whether or not it is unorthodox in any significant way, rather than because she is concerned about how others would perceive the fact of it being Christ's foreskin specifically.
So, I mean, if this was a media studies seminar and we were studying the back of a 1970s B-movie box and we read that vision as the description of the film, we'd have a pretty different view about what was going on there.
Absolutely. And that's partially because it's our own understanding of the world and our own kind of hang-ups about things like that. The idea that foreskin means penis, means oral sex if you're swallowing it. Like, those connections are things that we are making as modern readers that skews our perspective of what's happening. But also because it would make it seem, and this is how the discussion of this tends to go, because it is the thing that gets the most attention in scholarship, it does come across as this is what her whole work is about. This is everything that there is to know about her and her spirituality, when really it happens the twice. It's discussed one episode, the other, and then it is never mentioned again. And considering how many visions she has, how many experiences are in this work, that is a drop in the bucket when it comes to all of the more general discussion of the Eucharist and the other things that I've mentioned of advice for confession and confessors and concern about the Franciscan order and the appropriate behavior of people. So we would get, and I think we often have, a very different opinion of what these works are about when we see them mentioned in kind of a cursory fashion in a work that's about themes rather than in full investigations of individuals.
Well, that's so fascinating. So, I mean, what's your take on the fact that that passage is so popular now and dominates the historiography? What does it say about current researchers today?
Partially, I think it says that we like things that are weird and just completely out of left field from what we're expecting, which I think is something that vision is. Partially, I think that when it is discussed in kind of popular culture, it seems to be used often as a way of discrediting mystical experiences or discrediting Christianity, or kind of treated as an example of how ridiculous faith is, because people of faith believe that these kind of things happened, and isn't that hilarious and stupid? Which I think is incredibly disrespectful to people of faith, but also to the period and to the people who claim to have these kinds of experiences. I think that there's a lot more interesting happening than people give it credit for. I also think it just means that, she's not very well researched at this point. And so what people do know about her are the things that have been talked about in larger works that talk about themes like dedication to the body of Christ. And so this is one of the ways that manifests, or concern about Christ's humanity, which again, this is one of the things that happened to a real human body, and therefore is something that connects to his physical body and him shedding blood from a very young age. So I think the main thing that it reveals is that people haven't talked about her work very much up until this point, so they haven't gotten into some of the deeper, more complicated, what I think are more interesting things, but also that, a random, weird, potentially confusing story that is going to garner some kind of reaction out of a modern audience makes for an interesting subject.
I mean, that is strange, isn't it? I mean, the very things that make them interesting and worth looking at in the first place is the thing that they might be dismissed with in the first place, which is so strange to my mind.
Yeah, mine too. I mean, I've always found that the stranger these mystical works are, and the more that they differ from how the world is perceived now, the more intriguing they are and the more worth studying and talking about. It's one of the reasons that I started this podcast, is because I want to hear all of the weird stories, because they're fascinating. And the fact that someone had these experiences at some point, or if you're skeptical, someone claims to have had these experiences at some point, tells us something so interesting about the world that they were living in, that I can't see how anyone doesn't see that as worthy of exploration.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of a better reason to study anybody than to tell them about how fascinating they are.
Exactly. I mean, what is the point of what we do if it's not to tell cool stories about cool people? And that's one of the things that I really love about this work and about getting to talk to other people like yourself, but also like all of the guests that I've had on the podcast so far in the last year who have been so exuberant and enthusiastic about getting to share things about their favorite mystic because they are so incredibly fascinating. And to get to spend so much of our time looking at these interesting people and through them trying to learn things about the past, what could be better than that?
So, Amanda, why is Agnes your favourite? And actually, I'm going to sub-question that because it doesn't get asked enough. And I certainly found it studying the same thing for a long time. Is she still your favourite, having been studying her for a long time?
Well, I'll answer the second question first, which is, yeah, she's still my favorite.
Woohoo!
Yeah, it's definitely a good thing. And as for why she's my favorite, she is a never-ending, confusing puzzle of questions. And not because I can't understand her visions. The opposite, actually. I love how straightforward she is about the things that she sees and just immediately telling you what they mean. I've always really enjoyed that from the first time I read her work. But I feel like I constantly have new questions about the text. I feel like no matter how many times I read it, no matter how many ways I try to think about it, no matter how much additional information I get about Vienna and the 13th century and Franciscan piety and what it meant to be a woman in an urban center in that time, I still have questions, and I still want to come back to the text. And I keep learning about other mystics and enjoying their visions, and I love hearing about new people who had these kinds of experiences. I think that they're all fascinating, but I'm always finding a way to link them back to Agnes, to link what they experienced back to what I'm seeing in her work, because she has just got my heart, and I still love getting to work on her.
Oh, and long may it continue.
I mean, not the PhD. The PhD needs to end at some point, and hopefully sooner rather than later.
Well, I mean, you finished one project about her. There's always another one to begin, right?
Absolutely. There will be projects aplenty in the future. If I could spend the rest of my academic career working on her, I would be a very happy woman.
Well, thank you, Amanda, for such a wonderful podcast. I'm sure you'll be getting lots of questions from all your fantastic listeners. And I hope everyone else has enjoyed this as much as I have. Thank you very much.
My listeners are fantastic. Thank you all so much for listening, and thank you, Rob, for doing this. It was so much more fun than I thought it would be. And thank you to all of the guests that I've had over the last year. I've really appreciated all of you and all of the wonderful things that you've taught me through this podcast. Thank you, thank you, thank you. You can follow us on Twitter at MyFaveMystic, and join me next time when I speak to Sapasri Chakravarti about Kona.